All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another talk. In this session, we will have Vaishali Khandelwal, data and applied scientist at Microsoft, present how experimentation helped a small business grow during the pandemic. Just a quick note, please post your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat. You can find the Q&A box in the top right-hand corner top right-hand corner. And Vaishali, just a reminder to start your timer, and off you go.
Thank you. I am going to start my timer. And thanks a lot, Rebecca. I hope everyone is having a great time at the conference. I definitely am really enjoying it. I hope everyone's learning about different tools and networking with some amazing great data scientists. Just before getting started, a huge shout out to all our organizers and volunteers. I've been at this conference since morning and it's been an amazing experience. So really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much. So before getting started and before digging into the project, here's a little bit about me. I was born and raised in Calcutta, India. The image that you see on the top right is of an iconic monument in Calcutta called Victoria Memorial. I did an undergrad in computer science at University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. During my undergrad, I was the vice president and mentoring chair of the Women in Computer Science organization. I interned at Microsoft for 2 summers during 2015 and 2016, and that's kind of where I fell in love with both Microsoft and the Pacific Northwest. I started as a data scientist at Microsoft in July of 2017, and I've been on a bunch of different product data science teams, ranging from Windows 10 UI features like start menu, notifications, settings, to now account management and services. So that's been about my 5-year journey at Microsoft. In August of 2020, I started pursuing a part-time master's in information and data science at University of California, Berkeley, and I'm almost done with it. I'm going to graduate in August of 2022. So super excited for that. The project that I'm presenting today was part of this very program, and I'm going to dig deeper into that project. When I'm not looking at the patterns in data, I'm looking at the patterns outdoor. I love hiking, skiing, skating, anything outdoor. I'm an avid reader and also a trained dancer. So with that, let's jump into the project background. This project was part of the Experiments in Causal Inference course at University of California, Berkeley. It was part of the master's program that I'm doing currently. And the primary goal of the project was to run a field experiment through the application of statistics, causality, and A/B testing. So essentially, everything that we were learning in the course, we wanted to run a final project and run an actual field experiment through the application of all of those concepts. The project consisted of 3 other awesome students, so I'm presenting this group project on behalf of all of us. So when my team started brainstorming what field do we want to experiment in, one of the things that we were 100% certain about was that we wanted the experiment to have a social impact. The pandemic was at its peak. We know businesses were suffering left, right, and center. So we wanted to work on something that would have a social impact, that would help the business grow and learn, and also replicate the experiment if they wanted to do so. We also had one other thing in common, our love for food. We loved dining out. We loved all of these different cuisines, and that's where our project motivation came from. Even though we loved dining out and eating different kinds of cuisines, we were very tired of ordering the same dishes. We started wondering if a menu showed more than one option, or if a menu showed interesting food options, would we actually go for those options versus the regular ones or not? And then we started doing some background research. We found that a bunch of controlled studies had been run at the past, which were playing around with this very idea. A few studies at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a couple of others at a French restaurant in France were playing around with this idea of using interesting or descriptive menu labels and to see what the impact of that was. And what they found was that not just did that increase sales of those dishes, it also led to a positive impact on customer engagement with that restaurant. So it led to an increase in the positive comments and led to a growth of the restaurant. With that information, we basically went about setting up our hypothesis. Do descriptive menu labels improve sales of unpopular dishes? The primary goal with the hypothesis was to try and figure out if changing or keeping the menu labels interesting, would that impact the unpopular dishes? because we know that the popular dishes are things that people were already going for, and we kind of wanted to focus on those that the users weren't ordering at that point. So could we impact the sales of those dishes specifically? When I say descriptive menu label, what I essentially mean is that for this very, very appetizing image that you see, instead of saying chicken tikka masala, it would say something like Hyderabadi chicken lababdar. Also, hypothesis generation is a very crucial part of experimentation. I've been doing a bunch of different experiments at work in college, and hypothesis is something that helps establish the focus and the causal impact of the experiment. So one of the first things that you always want to do with an experiment is always have your hypothesis generated and established clearly to know what the experiment is focusing on. Once we had our hypothesis established, we went the pre-experiment steps. Once you have the hypothesis, once you're ready to start the experiment, there are many things that happen before the experiment actually starts. The first one for us was finding the right field to experiment in. The pandemic was at its peak. We had a bunch of hardships that we were running into. There were protocols that needed to be followed. We weren't being able to find a restaurant that wanted to cooperate with us, because that restaurant would actually have to make changes in their menu. And that was something that they weren't ready to experiment with. Especially the smaller businesses that were hit really hard, it was a very big ask from them to kind of try and change what their menu looks like and experiment with it. Just in case, what if their sales fell down from that? They were really worried about that. And we completely understood that worry. But at the same time, we were finding it so hard to get a restaurant that would not just coordinate with us, but also share their sales data with us. So that was the other thing, data sharing. Not many restaurants or not many fields were actually ready to do that with us. To top it all, we were a bunch of just grad students. We weren't seasoned researchers or anything. We were applying everything that we had learned from a course on to an experiment. And a lot of places we got turned down because we were literally asked, oh, you're just grad students? We can't really trust you with that. So, well, after a bunch of hardships and so many turn down and rejections, we were finally able to find a restaurant that was ready to cooperate and coordinate with us. It was an Indian bistro which had been established just a few months before the experiment was being run. So it was a new establishment, and they were very eager to learn from the experiment. That's kind of where our partnership worked very well. They wanted their business to grow. They wanted to see what were ways in which they could learn from this experiment and grow their business during the pandemic. And at the same time, it was great for us because we could be able to run the experiment and learn from that process and impact the business at the same time. So once we had the field established, we now went on to the next step, which was identifying the least popular dishes. As you can remember, the hypothesis was based on the unpopular dishes. So we now needed to figure out what these least popular dishes from the menu looked like. We were able to get sales data from the restaurant for the months of April and May, and we plotted it out on this bar chart and essentially found at that point that the top dishes that you see here, the top 10 to 13 dishes that you see here, were the least popular dishes. Something that happened when we were collecting this data from the restaurant was we realized that because it was such a new establishment, they didn't really have a very good sales management system in place. So when they gave us the data, some of it was in Excel sheets, and then some of it was just paper receipts. And we had to convert those paper receipts into the Excel sheet. So that 2 months of data, while it might just look like, oh, it's just 2 months, it actually took us a while to put together because they were just a bunch of paper receipts that then needed to be converted and converged with the existing data that we had. So with that, we were finally able to identify the least popular dishes for that restaurant. The third step was brainstorming the alternate names. Now that we knew what the least popular dishes were, we now needed to figure out what these descriptive menu labels would look like for these dishes. We wanted the descriptive menu labels to fall within 3 distinct categories: traditional, sensory, and location-based. So when I say sensory, what it basically means is that for something like paneer 65, it would say crispy paneer 65 or chatpata paneer 65. So you're adding a sensory adjective there that relates to the senses at that point. The same thing with location based. Instead of saying chicken tikka masala, it's going to say Hyderabadi chicken tikka masala. So you're adding a location there, which is describing the menu label further. The third category that we had was traditional. So we went about brainstorming names for these different categories, and we had about 3 to 4 alternate names for every dish. But we didn't want to be the ones to pick the exact name for every dish. We wanted that process to be as unbiased and as clear, clean and clear as possible, essentially. So we decided to run a survey. The survey was now going to be sent out to a bunch of random people. So we sent it out to our colleagues, our friends, our classmates over at Berkeley, just anyone and everyone. And the idea was that we didn't want the survey to reach anyone who was in the geographical location of the restaurant, because that would again skew the results and bias the results. So we decided to send the survey to a bunch of other random people. We had a raffle as part of the survey to kind of incentivize taking the survey. And we got about more than 100 responses, which we weren't expecting, but that was great. The one other thing that we did in that survey was not just did we provide them with a multiple choice option at that point, we also provided them with a text box wherein they could provide us interesting names. So the survey takers were also giving us very interesting names, and some of our labels came out of the interesting names that they provided us. So altogether, that survey, in an unbiased manner, helped us provide the list of treatment names for the dishes that we wanted to experiment on. Given all of this, we then started working with the restaurant and setting up the actual design of the experiment. So now for the experiment design. What we decided to do was to split all the dine-in orders at 50-50 to run the experiment. The reason we only stuck to dine-in orders was because implementing a randomization and implementing this experiment on an online stage level was becoming extremely hard. The infrastructure changes involved would take a lot of time, and we just didn't have that at our liberty at that point. So we decided to do a 50-50 split for all the dine-in orders, and every party or table would be considered one unit. What that essentially means is that instead of people at a table having different menus, which could lead to confusion, inconsistent user experience, and just would mess up the experiment more, we decided to keep it very clean and clear and have the party or the table serve as one unit. The primary outcome variables that we were looking at from the experiment were the counts and sales of treatment dishes. So those were the two primary factors that we wanted to impact from this experiment. We also conducted a power analysis and found that with a minimum power of 80% through a 2-sample t-test, we needed about 8 parties in control and treatment each. At that point when we were conducting this experiment, even 8 seemed like a number that we wouldn't be able to achieve because dine-in orders were on the decline and too many restrictions were in place. Pandemic was at its peak, but we were able to do it, and you're going to see that in the results. We also decided to run it over a span of 2 weeks to be able to see the differences between the weekday versus weekend covariate and to see if the day of the week had any correlation with the results that we were seeing. Now for the experiment setup and execution. The first step was designing and printing the treatment menus. So what we essentially did was we added a very small design change to the treatment menu that was only visible to the staff. It actually wasn't very visible to the customers, and we were well aware of the fact that just looking at it, they probably wouldn't be able to make out that they were being given a different menu. But the restaurant staff were trained in a way to ensure that they knew that these were the treatment menus. We also replaced the names of the treatment dishes with the descriptive labels that we wanted to provide it. So for instance, you can see on the image, gobi 65 became crispy gobi 65, and paneer 65 became chatpata paneer 65. We then went about training the restaurant staff as to how the randomization would work, how one party would be considered as one randomization unit, and everyone in that party would be given the same menu, and so on and so forth. Even though we had trained the staff, we were extremely hesitant of where the experiment would go. And we were very lucky that one of our teammates was in the geographical area of the restaurant itself. So she went in physically almost every day to ensure that the experiment was being run in the right manner. And we're very glad for her presence there because there were a lot of things that she was able to correct while the experiment was running and to ensure that the experiment was being done in the most clean manner as possible. So now with that, we had 2 weeks of data. We ensured to not look at the data while it was being generated, to, no peeking at the data, no introduction of bias, nothing. Finally, at the end of 2 weeks, we were able to look at what the data was. And we saw that there were 120 total dining parties, 60 in control, 60 in treatment. So we had gone far beyond what we had expected out of this experiment, and we had gotten a big enough sample size for both control and treatment. Something that we were worried about was that because we were randomizing at the unit, at the level of the table, were the number of people in control and treatment the same or not? And when we ran an average test, what we found was that there were about 3.38 in control and 3.73 in treatment. So they were very close to one another, and the average at that point wasn't mattering and was fine. So the first outcome variable that we wanted to look at was the sales of the dishes. And what we found was that the treatment group ordered one more experiment dish than the control group. So we ran the Welch's 2 sample t-test, and you can see the image on the top right. And there the p-value was stat sig, and we found that the treatment group was ordering more of the treatment dishes than the control group. We also ran tests to find what kind of a descriptive name had the most impact. And we found that the traditional descriptive menu labels had the most impact, followed by sensory, and then finally location. So traditional descriptive names were the ones that users in that specific area were relating most closely with. It's not that it's going to be the same in every restaurant, but for this specific experiment and for that geographical area, this is what worked best. The treatment group on average spent 12.8 more dollars than the control group on treatment dishes. So that was our second outcome variable, was the sales. And we found that the treatment group was actually spending more money, 12.8 to be precise, on the treatment dishes than the control group. Again, that was found through the Welch's 2 sample t-test, and the p-value was stat sig there. To understand the impact of the day of the week, we ran F-test models with and without the weekend covariate, and we found that the day of the week had no impact on the count of the dishes or the sales of treatment dishes. This could probably just be an impact of the pandemic because the days of the week are all blurring in together. It's very hard to figure out what day of the week it is, what time of the week it is, and maybe that's why it didn't have an impact, because the pandemic was at its peak at that point. So that could be one of the reasons, but if we probably ran it now, the numbers might look different, because I think just from looking at the way users are going to restaurants, they would probably visit the restaurants more often on a weekend versus a weekday. But for this specific case, it did not have any impact. But it did have a positive impact on the count of sales and the count of dishes and the net sales. The one other thing that we wanted to look at was the pre-experiment and during experiment phase. So the first 2 weeks that you see in this chart are the pre-experiment phase, and the next 2 weeks are the experiment phase when we were actively running the experiment. The blue line there is showing the net sales, the red line is the dine-in, and the yellow line at the very bottom is the treatment dishes. So during the experiment phase, even though the dine-in sales went down, which is probably an impact of the extra restrictions that were imposed during that time period, the sales of the treatment dishes went up. So that squiggly yellow line that you see at the very bottom, before the experiment phase, it was almost at a zero. And then during the experiment phase, we can see it going up. So the treatment dish sales actually did go up during that period. And that's exactly what we were trying to achieve. We were trying to ensure that the impact of the experiment on the restaurant's sales would go up. And that's exactly what happened during that phase. And with that, the key takeaways from this. With a simple field experiment and through the application of causality, we were able to establish that descriptive menu labels do indeed increase sales. Keeping the menu labels interesting, keeping them catchy, keeping them something that the customer can sometimes relate better to, they do increase the sales of unpopular dishes. And through this very A/B test, we were able to help a small business grow during the pandemic. The pandemic was an extremely testing time for businesses, especially the small ones. And, through this very simple experiment setup, we were able to help the business grow, learn about their customers, understand better of what they can change in the future if they want, and how they can play around with their menu and their dishes. So we were able to learn a lot from the experiment, but the restaurant itself was also able to learn and grow a lot from this experiment. So overall, it was a great partnership and it worked well in both our favors. And with that, that brings me to the end of the talk. I will now take any questions and I'll jump onto the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Yeah, you combined, I think people said in the chat, you combined like my love of experimentation and food. So thank you for your talk. So going on to the Q&A, I don't see any questions yet, but I have a question for you.
Yes.
like when you're looking at like your treatment and control groups, did you have any worries about like repeat customers coming in those 2 weeks, or did you control for that at all to make sure they got the same experience?
So that was something harder to control for, given that the restaurant was such a new establishment that they barely had a system in place. So we weren't actually able to figure out if the repeat customers would get the same menu or not. But because it was totally randomized, the number of repeat customers in control and treatment should be the same. So ideally, just working from the aspects of randomization, it would be exactly the same and would not make a difference to the impact of the experiment at that point.
See some questions in the chat. It's loading. Give me a minute. Very slowly.
Ways.
Sorry, it usually doesn't take this long.
No worries.
Try to refresh it. Huh. Oh, there's a third one. I can see them. I don't know if you can see them if they're loading for you.
I think I can. I'll take them.
Okay.
So one of the questions is, how hard was it to train the staff? So the restaurant was very understaffed, and that's one of the reasons why our classmate was also going in very often. She was almost working at the restaurant with them to ensure the experiment was working the right way. So it was considerably hard, but one of the things that we did was create a video of how they should go about the entire process, and that helped them a lot. We also had post-its everywhere in the restaurant that the staff could see, and they could make sure that they're doing the right thing. So we went about doing very small things that would help the restaurant staff a lot. But overall, yes, it was hard training the staff. So there's one other question. What did the restaurant think of all of this? Are they looking to expand this to other items? So, well, at the end of the experiment, when we provided the restaurant with all of this data, they were very happy looking at it. They decided to adopt the treatment menu as their actual menu. So now they have the treatment menu in the restaurant itself, which is awesome. And I think now something that they wanted to do further was understand what the effect of the experiment would be after the experiment was done. And because we didn't have the time to do it, and our class basically ended at that point, but we were able to we provided the restaurant with just sample scripts of how we were doing all of this stuff, and we trained them so they can do it in the future if they want. So I think overall the restaurant was very happy with how the experiment was run and how everything came together very well for them, and they're currently using the treatment menu. So for us, it was a big win that they're currently actually using it. So there's a question around how many businesses were we able to help grow through this? So this experiment was actually being conducted only for one specific restaurant. So we weren't actually doing it for a chain or anything. Honestly, getting a chain to agree with us was so hard. We went to a bunch of different restaurants, like literally called around everywhere we could to find out if someone would want to do this with us. And we weren't able to, which is why we pivoted on a small restaurant, a small business, and we conducted the experiment only with them. But now that we have kind of an infrastructure in place, if a restaurant wants to do it, we can obviously provide it to them. I do intend on writing a Medium blog about it and having this information out there. So if someone actually wants to reuse it, they can. But overall, it was just for that one specific restaurant. So do you want to go ahead, Rebecca?
No, I'm sorry. It's still loading for me. I think it's
Oh, okay. I'll just
rely on your Q&A. Sorry about that.
No worries. So there's another question on if there are any plans of expanding the experimentation to other businesses. We kind of wanted to see if we can templatize it in a way and provide it to restaurants. But again, just going back to the fact that this was just one of the class projects that we were doing. It was one of those 2-week, 3-week projects that we were running, and we were just lucky enough to be able to do it at that scale with this restaurant. But I'm hoping that through a blog that I write, I can have it out there. And any restaurant, any small business that wants to run a simple experiment, they can actually do it, because the growth and the impact from these experiments on the business of the restaurant or any business is actually massive. So yeah. I'm curious. So there's another question of, I'm curious what the effect of adding descriptors to every menu item versus a select few would be. So, well, we did look at some background research around this. There were researches where they changed everything, but the problem with changing everything in an experiment is that you can't actually pinpoint what is doing well versus what is not, because there are too many moving variables. Focusing on the unpopular dishes gave us that blocking of unpopular dishes, and we could focus on that specifically. So, around the idea of changing everything together, it might not work as well, because like we'll still want to do it in phases, otherwise we just can't pinpoint what variable attributed what. So it's very hard to establish causality at that point.
And I think it looks like there are more questions in the Q&A that I can't see, but I think we have time for one more question.
Okay, okay, so if the question now is, if the same option was provided to other restaurants, what might be the differentiating factor? So I guess for other restaurants, if they have a well-established online system, we would love to do it for online orders as well. It would be interesting to see how online orders would work, because you have to randomize in a way that two people sitting next to each other don't get different menus. And that is hard, because then you're looking at location and so many other details, right? It's also where the coordination with all of these apps through which people are ordering comes in. So that would be another factor. But if it was just for dine-in, I think something that would be interesting is to see if there was a multi-cuisine restaurant, how different cuisines are affected by descriptive menu labels. So would maybe Mexican be affected more than American, or American be affected more than Indian? So that would be interesting. Because when we picked the Indian restaurant, something that we were aware of was like, there are so many variations to it that we can learn more from it. So yeah, I think that's...
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Fantastic presentation. Learned a lot. Yeah, so this concludes our session. If you have any additional questions for our speaker, you can send a direct message to her in Excel events or connect on LinkedIn, and I will share that in the chat. Yeah, I'll share that in the chat shortly. And we look forward to seeing you in the following sessions and the expo booths. Thank you so much.